The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy, like the air itself is holding its breath. Every eye was fixed on the woman standing at the center of it all. She was tall, poised, and carried herself with a quiet confidence that seemed to command the room without her saying a word. Her dark skin glowed under the harsh fluorescent lights, and her sharp suit screamed authority. But what no one in that room knew, what they couldn't possibly have guessed, was that this woman wasn't just another defendant or lawyer. She was about to flip their world upside down. And the man who thought he was in control, the cop who had just stormed over to her with a scowl on his face, was seconds away from making the biggest mistake of his life. Officer Dan Harris was having a bad day. Scratch that. He was having a bad year. The department was under scrutiny, morale was low, and he was tired. Tired of the politics, tired of the paperwork, and tired of feeling like no one respected the badge anymore. So when he walked into the courtroom that morning, he wasn't in the mood for nonsense. He scanned the room, his eyes landing on the woman who stood out like a sore thumb. She wasn't sitting in the designated areas, and she wasn't dressed like everyone else. To him, she looked out of place, maybe even suspicious. Without thinking twice, he marched over, his boots echoing against the polished floor. "Ma'am," he barked, his voice sharp and dripping with authority. "You need to step back. This area's off limits." The woman turned slowly, her eyes locking onto his. There was something in her gaze, a calm, almost amused expression that made him pause. But he didn't back down. He couldn't, not in front of everyone. "I said step back," he repeated, his tone harsher this time. He reached out, his hand gripping her arm a little too tightly. The room gasped. Someone muttered, "Oh no." But the woman didn't flinch. She didn't pull away. Instead, she smiled. A small, knowing smile that sent a chill down his spine. "Officer Harris," she said, her voice smooth but firm, "you might want to think twice before you do something you'll regret." He froze. How did she know his name? And why did she sound so confident? Before he could process what was happening, the doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. A group of high-ranking officials walked in, their faces serious. At the front was the mayor, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. He stepped up to the podium and cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "I'd like to introduce you to the new chief of police." The room erupted. In whispers, Officer Harris's stomach dropped. His eyes darted back to the woman who was now stepping forward, her smile widening. "Chief Maya Collins," the mayor announced, "will be taking over effective immediately." The color drained from Harris's face. His grip on her arm loosened, but it was too late. The damage was done. Chief Collins turned to him, her expression unreadable. "Officer Harris," she said, her voice calm but laced with something sharp, "we'll be having a conversation about this later." The room was dead silent, the tension so thick you could cut it with a knife. Harris opened his mouth to say something, anything, but no words came out. He could feel the weight of every eye in the room on him, judging, waiting to see what would happen next. And as Chief Collins walked away, her heels clicking against the floor, he realized one thing. His bad day had just gotten a whole lot worse. But this wasn't the end. Not even close. Because what no one knew yet was that this moment, this clash between a cop who thought he was untouchable and a woman who refused to be underestimated, was just the beginning. Secrets were about to be uncovered, alliances tested, and the very foundation of the police department shaken to its core. And as the courtroom emptied, the whispers growing louder, one question lingered in the air. What would happen when Officer Harris and Chief Collins came face to face again? The answer would change everything. But for now, all anyone could do was wait and wonder. The courtroom emptied slowly, the murmurs of the crowd fading into the hallways like the hum of a storm retreating. Officer Dan Harris stood frozen, his mind racing but his body refusing to move. His hand still tingled where it had gripped Chief Collins's arm, the memory of her calm, piercing gaze burning into his thoughts. He felt like he'd just woken up from a nightmare, except this was real. Too real. Around him, the other officers exchanged glances, some smirking, others shaking their heads. Harris could feel their judgment, their silent laughter. He'd always been the kind of cop who didn't back down, who didn't take lip from anyone. But today, he'd crossed a line he didn't even see coming. Chief Maya Collins didn't look back as she walked out of the courtroom. She didn't need to. She could feel the weight of the moment, the ripple of shock that had spread through the room like a wave. It wasn't how she'd planned to make her entrance, but then again, life rarely went according to plan. As she stepped into the hallway, the mayor fell into step beside her, his face pale and his hands fidgeting with his tie. "Chief Collins," he began, his voice low and urgent, "I apologize for that incident. Officer Harris is a good cop, but he can be a little overzealous." Maya raised an eyebrow but said nothing. She'd heard it all before. Good cop, bad day. Overzealous, misunderstood. Excuses were easy to make, but they didn't change the facts. And the fact was, Harris had crossed a line. She'd seen it in his eyes, the arrogance, the assumption that he could do whatever he wanted because of the badge on his chest. It was a mentality she'd spent her entire career fighting against. And now, as the new chief of police, she had the power to do something about it. But she wasn't going to rush. Not yet. She needed to see the bigger picture, to understand the dynamics of this department she'd just inherited. Because one thing was clear, this wasn't just about Officer Harris. This was about a system, a culture, and a city that was watching. Back. In the courtroom, Harris finally found his legs and stumbled out into the hallway. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, each one more panicked than the last. How had he not known? How had he not recognized her? The new chief had been the talk, the department for weeks, but no one had mentioned her name, let alone what she looked like. And now, because of his temper, because of his stupid pride, he'd made an enemy of the most powerful person in the department on her first day. He leaned against the wall, running a hand through his hair. "Harris," a voice called out. He turned to see his partner, Officer Ramirez, walking toward him, a look of concern on his face. "You okay, man?" Harris let out a bitter laugh. "Do I look okay?" Ramirez shrugged, his expression sympathetic but cautious. "Look, I get it. That was rough. But you've got to be careful, man. She's not just anyone. She's the chief now, and from what I've heard, she doesn't play around." Harris frowned. "What have you heard?" Ramirez glanced around, making sure no one was listening, then leaned in closer. "Rumor is she's here to clean house. The mayor brought her in because of all the scandals, all the complaints. She's got a reputation for being tough, like really tough, and she doesn't care who she pisses off." Harris felt a knot tighten in his stomach. Great. Just great. Not only had he embarrassed himself in front of the entire department, but he'd also managed to piss off the one person who could end his career with a snap of her fingers. He pushed off the wall and started walking, Ramirez following close, behind. "Where are you going?" Ramirez asked. "To do damage control," Harris muttered, "before it's too late." Meanwhile, Chief Collins was already deep in her new office, poring over files and reports. The room was spacious but bare, the walls still empty, the desk cluttered with paperwork. She'd barely had time to unpack, but that didn't matter. There was work to be done. As she flipped through the files, her frown deepened. The numbers were worse than she'd expected. Complaints against officers were up. Trust in the department was down. And then there were the internal reports. Cases of misconduct, use of excessive force, even allegations of corruption. It was a mess, a big ugly mess, and it was her job to clean it up. But as she read, one name kept popping up, Officer Dan Harris. He wasn't the worst offender, not by a long shot, but he was problematic. There were complaints about his attitude, his temper, his tendency to escalate situations unnecessarily. And then there was the incident in the courtroom. That hadn't been in any of the files, but it told her everything she needed to know. Harris was a loose cannon, the kind of cop who thought the rules didn't apply to him. And if her instincts were right, he wasn't the only one. She leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. This wasn't going to be easy. She'd known that coming in. But seeing it all laid out in black and white made it feel even more daunting. She needed a plan, a strategy. She couldn't just come in swinging, not without risking a full-blown mutiny, but she also couldn't afford to wait. The city was watching, and so was her team. She needed to make a statement, to show that things were going to change. And she needed to do it soon. As if on cue, there was a knock at the door. "Come in," she called, sitting up straight. The door opened and Officer Harris stepped inside. He looked nervous, uncomfortable, like a man who knew he was walking into the lion's den. "Chief Collins," he began, his voice hesitant, "I just wanted to apologize for what happened earlier. It was a misunderstanding and I—" She held up a hand, cutting him off. "Save it, Officer Harris," she said, her tone firm but not unkind. "I don't need apologies, I need accountability, and right now I'm not seeing a lot of that from you." He opened his mouth to respond, but she didn't give him the chance. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to go back to work and you're going to do your job, by the book. No shortcuts, no attitude, no excuses. And if I hear one more complaint about you, if I see one more incident like what happened today, we're going to have a much longer conversation. Understood?" Harris nodded, his face pale. "Understood." She studied him for a moment, then nodded toward the door. "You can go." He turned and left, closing the door softly behind him. Maya let out a long breath, leaning back in her chair again. That had been the easy part. The hard part was still to come. Because as much as she wanted to believe that Harris would fall in line, she knew better. People didn't change overnight, and if her gut was right, this wasn't the last time she'd be dealing with Officer Dan Harris. Outside, Harris walked down the hallway, his mind racing. He'd expected anger, maybe even a suspension. But this was worse. She hadn't yelled, hadn't threatened. She just dismissed him, like he was nothing, and that stung more than anything. He clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. He wasn't going to let this go. He couldn't. He'd worked too hard, sacrificed too much to let some outsider come in and tear him down. But as he reached the end of the hallway, a thought occurred to him. What if she wasn't the enemy? What if she was just doing her job? The idea was unsettling, and he quickly pushed it aside. No, she was the enemy, and he wasn't going to let her win. But as he stepped outside into the bright sunlight, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. Something big. And whether he was ready or not, he was going to be right in the middle of it. The days that followed were tense, like the calm before a storm. Officer Dan Harris tried to keep his head down, to do his job by the book as Chief Collins had ordered. But it wasn't easy. Every time he put on his uniform, he felt the weight of her words pressing down on him. Accountability. The word echoed in his mind like a taunt. He'd always prided himself on being a good cop, on doing what needed to be done to keep the streets safe. But now, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, judged, and found wanting. Meanwhile, Chief Maya Collins was settling into her new role, but it wasn't without its challenges. The department was a minefield of egos, alliances, and old grudges. She'd expected resistance, but the level of pushback she was getting was something else entirely. Officers who had been with the department for decades were openly skeptical of her, questioning her decisions and whispering behind her back. She knew it was partly because she was an outsider, but she also knew it was because she was a woman, and a black woman at that. It wasn't the first time she'd faced this kind of resistance, and it wouldn't be the last. But that didn't make it any easier. One of the biggest thorns in her side was Sergeant Tom Reynolds, a grizzled veteran who'd been with the department for over 30 years. He was old school, the kind of cop who believed in doing things the way they'd always been done, and he made no secret of his disdain for the new chief. "She's going to ruin this department," he muttered to anyone who would listen. "All this talk about accountability and reform, it's just a bunch of political nonsense. Cops need to be cops, not social workers." His words found a receptive audience among the more conservative members of the force, and soon, a quiet rebellion began to brew. But Maya wasn't blind to what was happening. She had her own allies, officers who were tired of the old ways and eager for change. One of them was Officer Lisa Nguyen, a young, idealistic cop who'd joined the force straight out of college. Lisa had been one of the first to welcome Maya, and the two had quickly formed a bond. "They're scared," Lisa said one afternoon as they sat in Maya's office, going over a stack of reports. "They know you're not going to let them get away with the same old crap, and that terrifies them." Maya nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Fear can be a powerful motivator," she said, "but it can also make people reckless. We need to be careful. If we push too hard, too fast, we risk blowing everything up." Lisa frowned. "So what do we do?" Maya leaned back in her chair, her eyes narrowing. "We play the long game. We gather evidence, build cases, and when the time is right, we strike. But we have to be smart about it. One wrong move and this whole thing could come crashing down." Meanwhile, Harris was struggling to keep his own demons at bay. The incident in the courtroom had shaken him more than he cared to admit, and he found himself second-guessing everything he did. Was he being too aggressive? Too confrontational? He didn't know anymore. And then there was the guilt. He'd always told himself he was one of the good guys, but now he wasn't so sure. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how much he'd let his ego and his temper cloud his judgment. But admitting that to himself was one thing. Admitting it to anyone else? That was a whole different story. His partner, Ramirez, noticed the change in him. "You've been quiet lately," he said one evening as they sat in their patrol car waiting for a call. "Everything okay?" Harris shrugged, staring out the window. "Just thinking," he said. Ramirez raised an eyebrow. "About what?" Harris hesitated, then sighed. "About everything. About whether I'm really cut out for this anymore." Ramirez frowned. "Come on, man. Don't let that stuff with the chief get to you. You're a good cop. You've just got to, I don't know, adjust, adapt. That's all." Harris nodded, but he wasn't convinced. Adjusting wasn't going to be enough. Not this time. Because deep down he knew that the problem wasn't just the chief or the department or even the job. The problem was him, and he wasn't sure how to fix that. As the days turned into weeks, the tension in the department continued to grow. Small incidents began to escalate. Officers showing up late, reports being filed incorrectly, evidence going missing. It was subtle, but it was there. And Maya knew exactly what it was. Sabotage. Someone, or someone's, was trying to undermine her to make her look incompetent, but she wasn't going to let them win. She had a plan, and she was going to see it through no matter what. One evening, as she was leaving the station, she ran into Harris in the parking lot. He looked surprised to see her, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Then finally, Maya broke the silence. "Officer Harris," she said, her tone neutral. "How are things going?" He hesitated, then shrugged. "Fine," he said. "Just fine." She studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Good, keep it that way." And with that, she turned and walked away, leaving him standing there, staring after her. But as she drove home, Maya couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. Something big. And when it did, she needed to be ready. Because one thing was clear. This wasn't just about her or Harris or even the department. This was about the city, about justice, about doing what was right. And she wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not ever. Meanwhile, Harris stood in the parking lot watching her car disappear into the distance. He didn't know what to think anymore. Part of him wanted to hate her, to see her as the enemy. But another part of him, a part he didn't want, to acknowledge, admired her. She was strong, confident, unshakable. Everything he used to think he was. And that scared him more than anything. As he got into his own car and drove away, he couldn't shake the feeling that the ground was shifting. Beneath him, that everything he thought he knew was about to change. And when it did, he wasn't sure where he'd stand. But one thing was certain. The storm was coming. And when it hit, nothing would ever be the same. The storm that had been brewing for weeks finally began to break one rainy evening. The streets were slick with water. the city lights reflecting off the pavement like shards of glass. Officer Dan Harris was on patrol with Ramirez, the tension between them thicker than the fog that clung to the windshield. Harris had been quieter than usual, his mind racing with thoughts he couldn't quite untangle. He'd tried to push Chief Collins out of his head, but she was everywhere. Her words, her presence, her unshakable calm. It was like she'd gotten under his skin and he couldn't shake her. Ramirez glanced at him, breaking the silence. "You've been off all week?" "Man, what's going on?" Harris tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his jaw clenching. "Nothing, just thinking." Ramirez raised an eyebrow. "About what, the chief?" Harris didn't answer, but the look on his face said it all. Ramirez sighed. "Look, I get it. She's tough, but maybe that's what this department needs. Someone to shake things up." Harris shot him a look. "Since when are you on her side?" Ramirez held up his hands. "I'm not on anyone's side. I'm just saying, maybe it's time for a change." Before Harris could respond, the radio crackled to life. "All units, we have a 1031 in progress at the corner of 5th and Maple. Shots fired. Proceed with caution." Harris's heart skipped a beat. A 1031, an armed robbery. He exchanged a quick glance with Ramirez, then flipped on the sirens and sped toward the scene. The rain pounded against the windshield as they raced through. The streets, the city blurring into a haze of light and shadow. When they arrived, the scene was chaos. A small convenience store was lit up like a beacon, its windows shattered, glass scattered across the sidewalk. A crowd had gathered, their faces pale and panicked. Harris and Ramirez jumped out of the car, their guns drawn as they approached the store. "Police!" Harris shouted, his voice cutting through the rain. "Come out with your hands up." There was no response, just the sound of muffled voices and the faint creak of a door swinging open. Inside the store, a man in a black hoodie was pacing back and forth, a gun clutched in his hand. His face was twisted with fear and desperation, his eyes darting toward the door. Behind the counter, a young clerk was crouched on the floor, her hands over her head, her body trembling. Harris's heart raced as he took in the scene. This wasn't just a robbery. This was a hostage situation. "We need backup," Ramirez muttered, his voice low. Harris nodded, his eyes never leaving the man in the hoodie. "Call it in." As Ramirez radioed for assistance, Harris took a step closer, his gun raised. "Hey!" he called out, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "Let her go. This doesn't have to end badly." The man turned to face him, his eyes wild. "Stay back," he shouted, waving the gun erratically. "I'll shoot, I swear I'll shoot." Harris froze, his mind racing. He'd been in situations like this before, but something about this felt different. The man wasn't a hardened criminal. He was scared, desperate, and that made him unpredictable. Harris took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. "Okay," he said, his voice calm. "Okay, just take it easy. No one has to get hurt here. Let's talk, all right?" The man hesitated, his grip on the gun tightening. "I don't want to talk," he said, his voice shaking. I just need money. I need to get out." "Here!" Harris's mind raced. He needed to de-escalate the situation, but one wrong move could set the man off. He glanced at the clerk, her wide eyes filled with terror. He couldn't let anything happen to her. He had to do something. But what? Before he could decide, the sound of sirens filled the air. Backup had arrived. Harris felt a flicker of relief, but it was short-lived. Because as the doors burst open and officers flooded into the store, the man in the hoodie panicked. "No!" he shouted, his voice cracking. "Stay back! I'll shoot her! I swear I'll shoot her!" He grabbed the clerk by the arm, yanking her to her feet and pressing the gun to her head. The room fell silent, the tension so thick it was suffocating. Harris's heart pounded in his chest as he locked eyes with the man. "Don't do this," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Please, just let her go. We can work this out." The man shook his head, his face pale and sweaty. "It's too late," he whispered. "It's too late." And then, out of nowhere, a voice cut through the tension. "Officer Harris, stand down." Harris turned, his eyes widening as Chief Maya Collins stepped into the store, her expression calm but commanding. She was dressed in full uniform, her badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. The room seemed to hold its breath as she walked forward, her eyes never leaving the man in the hoodie. "My name is Chief Collins," she said, her voice steady and reassuring. "I'm here to help. Let's talk, okay?" The man stared at her, his grip on the gun faltering for just a moment. I don't know," he stammered. I didn't mean for this to happen." Maya nodded, her expression softening. "I know," she said, "and we can fix this. But you need to let her go. Please." The man hesitated, his eyes darting between Maya and Harris. The tension in the room was unbearable, every second stretching into an eternity. And then, just as it seemed like he might lower the gun, a loud bang echoed through the store. Harris's heart stopped as the man crumpled to the ground, the gun slipping from his hand. The clerk screamed, scrambling away as officers rushed forward. Harris turned, his eyes wide with shock, to see Sergeant Reynolds standing in the doorway, his gun still raised. "Threat neutralized," Reynolds said, his voice cold and matter-of-fact. Maya's face darkened as she turned to face him. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" she demanded, her voice sharp with anger. Reynolds shrugged, holstering his gun. "My job," he said. "That's what you wanted, isn't it? Accountability." Maya's jaw tightened, her eyes blazing. "This isn't accountability," she said. "This is reckless. You could have gotten someone killed." Harris stood frozen, his mind reeling. The man on the ground wasn't moving, his blood pooling on the floor. The clerk was sobbing, her hands pressed to her mouth. And Reynolds looked almost smug, like he'd just proven a point. Harris felt a surge of anger, but it was quickly drowned out by a wave of guilt. Because deep down, he knew that this wasn't just Reynolds' fault. It was his too. He'd hesitated. He'd faltered. And now, someone was dead. As the paramedics rushed in and the scene descended into chaos, Maya turned to Harris, her expression unreadable. "We'll talk later," she said, her voice low. "But right now, I need you to hold it together. Can you do that?" Harris nodded, his throat too tight to speak. Maya gave him a long, searching look, then turned and walked away, leaving him standing there in the middle of the chaos. The storm had broken, but the worst was yet to come. And as Harris looked around at the shattered store, the blood on the floor and the faces of his fellow officers, he knew one thing for certain: nothing would ever be the same again. The question was, what would he do about it?